All right, welcome everybody to the second session of Beth Lida Online Learning's new series that's going to take us through Passover on Judaism and the environment. Why through Passover? Because it's the Shemitah year, which is the climactic year of a 7-year cycle in which the earth is supposed to rest, especially in the Holy Land. And that kind of notion of Shemitah is especially significant through Nisan. So I figure that's a nice natural way to carry us until Passover. Not only that, but it is Happy Rosh Chodesh Shvat, everybody. It's Rosh Chodesh Shvat today. So we are in the the official month of thinking about trees. As in 2 weeks, in two Sundays from now, we will have two Sunday evenings from now. We are going to have our own third annual Tu B'Shvat Seder in partnership, in cooperation with Sharei Shemayim. So I'm very excited. We just heard back from Rabbi Sammy today and Rabbi Jared, and we're really excited to keep this partnership going. So keep posted for the details. We'll make flyers and stuff for that. But in the meanwhile, last week we kicked off our learning about Judaism and the environment by looking at the theological underpinnings of what it means to be in creation, to recognize the created nature of the universe, to recognize the creator through the things that God has made, and to recognize subjectively what it means for us to be creatures in that larger system. If you want to catch up with that class, it is on the Rabbi Joshua Schwartz YouTube page and the podcast, Reb Josh's Torah. Tonight, we're going to look at trees. We're going to kind of start to narrow our focus before next week, we'll do a whole class on Tu B'Shvat before we get to the Seder. But tonight, we're going to look at the halachic obligations that are specifically oriented around our relationship to trees, but we'll see that the tree is not the strict construction of the law. It's not just about how we relate to trees, but the tree is kind of the launching pad for thinking about how we relate to the entirety of the created world. So let's start looking at the sources now, but as you can most likely perhaps anticipate, the halachic linchpin that's going to occupy our discussion for this evening will be the mitzvah of, shout it out now, Bal Tashchit, exactly, which is a kind of a shorthand for the mitzvah, meaning do not destroy. So let's look at the kernel text, the source text for this principle. Okay. So it says, Ki tatsur el ir yamim rabim, hilachem aleha litofsa, lo tashchit et etza, lindoch alav garzen, ki mimenu tochel, ve'oto lo tichrot, ki ha'adam etz hasadeh. Keep that phrase in mind. Lavo mipanecha bamatzor. So it is the first pasuk. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 20 in the Parsha of Shoftim, and it's in the middle of regulations and laws about how to wage a just war, or the laws that govern the way you wage war. Already we can think of the Havamina, right? The Havamina, which is unfortunately used even today by people who wage war. Namely, it's inhumane. It's a whole different world you're in when you're in battle, and thus the things that people do, they should not be held responsible for. So already God holds us to a higher standard than that and says, even in the middle of brutality, there still is some sense of constraint, right? It's not just catch as catch can. It's not that everything goes, but rather there are certain things you are allowed to do, certain things you have permission to do in extreme circumstances, and certain things you don't. I want us to kind of be in that kind of way of thinking. Zoom out for a second. There are two kinds of laws. There are what's called, Jonathan, do not correct me. There are apodictic laws and there are casuistic laws. This is Torah-wise. Apodictic law is thou shalt not kill. Casuistic law is if you are walking along the way and you see your fellow struggling under a burden, go help them. What's the difference between those two kinds of laws? Think of it like rhetorically. Yeah.
One is active, like
Mhm.
thou shalt, a negative, thou shalt not.
Mhm.
actually, that's the one that's not active. That's the one like, don't do it.
That's
and the
true.
other one is active. You should do this. You should
Okay.
go ahead and do this. It's active.
Great. So you're gesturing to a different two categories of law, namely positive and negative commandments. And you're absolutely correct. There's mitzvot aseh, things that God commands us to do, and there's mitzvot lo ta'aseh, things that God commands us not to do. So you're absolutely right. But here we're talking about two different ways that law is framed. So we're going to talk about positive and negative soon. But I just want us to think about these two different ways to think about what it means to be inside of a law, the way that law constructs the way that you live. So saying thou shalt not kill, are there conditions for that? At least just in the strict text of the law. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Right? Think of the 10 commandments, right? Type of thing. That is what is called apodictic. It is a simple and direct command. Don't do it. Casuistic law, or case law, paints a picture. And it says, if you're tripping down the road, right? Let's say you are living your life and you happen upon this situation, then this is what you're supposed to do or not do. Do we get the difference between those two things? One is a principle that governs your life, in which there's never a case in which and you don't encounter it, you stay away. And the other is a way of thinking about how to weave your way through life, to live within a certain type of situation, something that arises and it coincides with the path of your life. That's casuistic law. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's an essential way to think about, I think Torah in general, which is trying to give us rules and pathways in which we live real life in the real world. Torah isn't about ideals. Torah is about trying to bring the ideal to reality. But in specific here, what we're talking about is an extreme case, right? It's in extremis. The case is war, right? War is something you hope you never have to do. And yet, if you find yourself in this unfortunate situation, tragic situation of war, here are still the ways in which God is keeping certain things from occurring. God is keeping you from doing certain things. Okay, so what's the situation we're talking about here? Ki tatsur al ish yamim rabim. When you are in the midst of making siege on a city. Okay, so you are warring with a city for some reason. Maybe it's in the process of settling the land. Maybe it's in the process of waging war against actually, that's going to be a little bit different. Maybe you're in the process of waging a defensive war in some way in which you have to then retaliate. Who knows what it is? But you're besieging a city. Okay? And there's another qualification. Yamim rabim, for many days. Now that, we're going to bring that up later, but it's interesting that the Torah notes that. So already, let's say you're on day one of the siege. That's not many days, right? So you're waging war on the city. You're besieging it. Litofsa, to capture it in some way. Lo tashchit et etza, do not destroy its trees. Okay? Lindoach alav garzen, wielding an axe against them. Ki mimenu tochel, rather you can eat from them. V'otolo tichrot, but you cannot cut them down. Ki ha'adam etza sadeh lavo mipanecha v'matzor. It seems like in the pshat what that means is asking a question. Is the tree like a human being? Or like a human being is a tree such that it could take shelter from you? Meaning what? How is it, by comparing a human being to a tree negatively, right? It's dialectic. By contrasting a human being with a tree, what is the pasuk implying? Is the tree like a human being such that it could go take shelter? The answer is?
The tree can't move.
Tree can't move! Tree can't move. Tree, no move. Right? Tree cannot move. Tree cannot defend itself. Tree cannot run away. Tree cannot avoid. Tree cannot enter protracted negotiations. Right? A tree has no way to defend itself. And thus, what's the implication? Since the tree is not like a human being, i.e. does not have its own agency, thus what?
You can't attack it.
Right, very nice. You cannot attack. That's a very good way of putting it. You can't wage war against it. Okay, you are waging war against the city. You are allowed to attack the city, use siege works against the city, fling those big boulders with a trebuchet against the city. You are allowed to kill people in war. I said do not kill. That's something you're not supposed to do. It's like a law. Yeah, except, right, in this extreme circumstance in which you are allowed to kill. War. And yet, in the middle of having the permission to do the most unforgivable thing in the world, killing, there are still limits on what you are allowed to do and what you're not. And quite nicely, quite aptly, as Lauren just put it, you are not allowed to wage war against the trees. Well, again, I want us to think of havaminas, because I do want us to think about this halachically. When I say havamina, it's what is the Torah responding to? Havamina literally means I would have said, i.e., the Torah is saying this because how could you have thought? You could think total war, right? Okay, I'm at war with the city. I have carte blanche. I can wage total war. I can raise the city to its studs, right? But no, there's a protected class here. Trees. All right, tree. The trees around the city. You can think of it geographically. Okay, so you're allowed to wage war against the city, but then a certain, radius outside the city, you're not allowed to attack. No. Or there are certain things that are, defenseless that you're not allowed to wage war against. Okay. Rak eitz asher teda ki lo eitz ma'achalhu oto tashchit. Only a tree that you know is not a tree of food, that you can destroy. Vicharata uvanita matzor. You can cut it down and build a siege work, right? Some kind of like ramp or, I don't know, whatever they use to wage war in a siege. Some kind of siege work. It is a word, siege work. Some kind of siege work. Al ha'ir, on the city. Asher hi osa imecha milchama ad ridita. You're allowed to cut down a non-food tree that you can destroy, cut down, and build a siege work with, to wield against the city against which you are waging war, until it falls. Right? I.e., until you win. Okay, so we have a certain number of conditions here. One condition is you're not allowed to cut down, it says, the tree. But it says then you are allowed to cut down the tree. So let's start with what are you allowed to do? Okay, so Susie is saying weaponry. It seems that you are allowed to make use of trees, i.e. natural resources, for the specific cause or reason of waging this specific battle. Right? Until it's over. Until the battle's over. Until the siege is won. That's what you are allowed to do. But except what kind of tree? What kind of tree are you allowed to cut down? What kind of tree are you not allowed to cut down?
Only one that doesn't bear fruit.
Good. And I want to pay attention also to the word asher teda, which you know. And we're going to bring that up later. But, okay, good. So, is there ever a case in which you can cut down, just in the pasuk, a fruit-bearing tree? A fruit tree. Like an apple tree, date tree, olive tree.
I suppose if you misidentified it and you didn't know it was a fruit tree.
Okay, that's interesting.
You
That's
could
possible.
say, gee, I didn't know.
Okay, Susie asks if it's done. Okay, so Lauren is saying there's the case of shogeg, but that's not when you're allowed to. That's when you accidentally do something wrong. Right? So that's what's called b'shogeg. It's when you make a transgression, but it wasn't on purpose. Susie's asking if it's dying. Okay, we're going to get to that later. You're quite right to intuit that, but just in the strict psukim, I just want to focus on these verses. It seems that fruit trees are verboten, right? You cannot cut down a fruit tree. Now again, I want us to think of the havamina. What's the havamina here? What might you have thought? Again, you're in war. You're waging a siege against a city. What aren't you allowed to do? Remember, it's a siege. How do you win a siege?
You actually starve the people and you don't give them food or drink.
Yeah. Good. So what are you not allowed to do?
I guess in this case, you're not starving them because you're allowing them to have their fruit trees to eat
Right.
from.
So I'm sure you are allowed to block trade routes, keep any shipments from going in. You can murder every single Amazon driver that comes to the siege. I'm sure that's the case. But what you're not allowed to do is destroy the basic resources that the city needs to survive. The fruit tree, the engine that makes food. Does that make sense? Right? You are allowed to wage war, but it seems like Torah is implying you're not allowed to wage total war. You cannot destroy this city for time immemorial. You are allowed to interrupt this city while you besiege it only until it falls, which means it is time bound. Because if you kill the fruit tree, if you attack the fruit tree in your way of putting it, which I love, if you attack the fruit tree, that's not just against the contemporary residents of the city, but it's about the city forever. Because it takes a while for a tree to grow back. It's a big deal to kill a tree. I want us in all of our thinking to think of scarcity, to think of how limited resources are in a desert economy, how limited resources are in a pre-industrial economy, because I want us to remember also that the surplus that we believe we live in is very contentious. It's very contingent. It's unclear how secure it is, the surplus we think we live in. Okay, so Shosh is kind of abstracting a bit and saying that we're not allowed to compromise nature, that there's a system already in place for what it means to sustain the basic livelihood needs of the people. The tree, and actually we're going to see that it's going to expand and go to the sources of water as well. That you're not allowed to destroy them, you're just allowed to interrupt them.
Are you saying you're allowed to kill a person who is harvesting the fruit from the tree?
I mean, you are in war. If somebody like leaves the city, I imagine if they're surrendering, it's not cool to kill them. But if, let's say, they are leaving the city or whatever and sneaking out and are active combatants, then yeah, I mean that's within the rules of engagement, right? But what's beyond what's deemed appropriate or approved of is to have a deeply futural impact on this place you're waging war on. Right? You are not just waging war against the people alive now, you are waging war against their children and their children's children and their children's children's children. I wonder if maybe in the back of this pasuk is the notion of, like the sins will not be visited upon your children or your children's children. Right? Yes, you're waging war against the city, but their descendants don't deserve to starve to death because of you. Okay, so we have the basic principle here. Okay, let's just summarize again. Sikum. You are not allowed to attack a fruit tree because it is a source of sustenance for the city. You are allowed to, for very specific reasons, cut down a non-fruit-bearing tree for the sake of specifically that battle, and only until it's over. Okay, is that clear? So let's look at some other limiting factors. So Ibn Ezra, okay, we got a quick comment from the chat. Yeah, very good point, Susie. So on one hand, it's altruistic, right, in the sense that you're hurting their children's children, their children's children's children, etc. Think about like the Amazon rainforest, right? It's called kind of poetically the lungs of the world, right, because of how much carbon dioxide it takes in, how much oxygen it produces. Like it's like the lungs that function for the planet. And yet, right, Jair Bolsonaro is just clear cutting the thing and creating devastating impact on the sustainability of the world, right? In terms of needing the oxygen to be scrubbed, the carbon dioxide to be scrubbed and the oxygen to be produced. All right, so it is not just, thinking in terms of what Susie just said in the chat, it's not just an altruistic point, but rather we're all interconnected, right? If you are going to be besieging the city and then you're going to, take it over, then you're not going to have the trees anymore either. And actually, you're, again, you genius Talmud scholars. We'll see a comment to that import soon. Okay, so Ibn Ezra, a 12th century Spanish rationalist / Neoplatonist commentator who's especially attentive to the language of the text, he says this. He says, until it falls. What does this imply? Because if it weren't resilient, the verse wouldn't have had to say many days. Now, why did I include that? That has nothing to do with a tree. It has nothing to do with the mitzvah, seemingly. But why did I put that there? I think because it's heightening, right, underscoring the exceptional nature of this. It is only in the extreme case of besieging a city for many days that you are then allowed to deviate from the norm and cut down a tree. I.e., many things need to be set up to be finally allowed to have resource expenditure, right? To use the tree. It has to be many days because the city is resilient. It is defending itself against you. Only in this extreme case, basically the worst case scenario for a siege. You want the siege to be over quickly. You don't want it to go for many days. It's bad for you too, right? But if it's going for many days, then in that extreme case, that is when you're allowed to cut down a non-fruit-bearing tree. And you're still not allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree. Okay, let's keep it going. This is Forno, a Renaissance Italian commentator. He says, only trees that you know do not yield fruit, even if it is of a known species that does yield food, if you know it is old or defective such that it no longer bears fruit that is worth the toil of the harvest, that you can destroy. So here we already see a certain kind of, again, when I said casuistic law, being in the middle of context, being in the middle of situations, here what we have is a negotiation. What if it's a tree that is like an apple tree or something like that, but it hasn't borne fruit in a while, and whatever fruit it bears is like minimal and of not great quality, and it's not worth harvesting anymore. In that case, are you allowed to cut down the tree?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Good. And here what we see is basically the wheel of the ideal hitting the rubber, the rubber of the ideal hitting the road of real life, right? Now, I mean, also, what's important about the subtle change of context? What's the situation Sforno's talking about? Is it a siege? I would argue it can't be a siege. Why? Because you're not, even though the siege might go on for Yamim Rabim, there's no way you're going to be a siege long enough to know if a tree bears fruit anymore or not. That takes years. That takes decades. Right? So, I mean, I think there's a machmir point in that, and there's a makil point in that. There's a stringent point, and then there's a lenient point. The lenient point is that we're talking about real life now. We're not just talking about the specific case of a war in which that's the only case you can cut down a tree. No, Sforno is like, listen, let's say you are, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a situation. Let's say, here's a good one. Let's say there's a pool of water that's you're responsible for. You need to build a wall around it, otherwise someone might slip and die. So there's a tree right where you need to build the wall. Are you allowed to cut down that tree or not? Okay, so let's be very strict and say, I mean, I think everyone would say yes, but even let's say, is it a fruit tree or not? You have to figure out whether it is a fruit tree. And if it's a fruit tree, if it's a tree that is no longer bearing fruit anymore or not. The reason I am bringing this in is we can see that A, it is not just the ideal of like, oh, isn't it nice conservation is beautiful, but rather it is recognizing that within the larger system of the environment, the biome, right, the ecological system, our needs are also a factor thereof. So what we're really talking about is a balance between the tree's needs i.e. the needs of that which cannot defend itself, and our needs. And the question is going to continually be, are we able to find a wise and considerate balance between what we need and what the world needs? Or maybe in a different way of putting it is, can we recognize the difference? Can we discern the difference between what we want and what we need? And which of those two are allowed to govern the way that we relate to the world around us? I think the other thing I want to put about the word teda is that it also implies a certain kind of relationship. You need to know something about these trees. It's not just a stranger to you. You need to know if it's the kind of species that produces fruit or not. You need to know if this specific tree has reached its retirement age. And if it's also, in a situation in which it is a sad loss, but it's something that makes sense because it is not having an overburdened impact on the future. I think the sustainability question is within the technology of the pasuk of this law. You are not allowed to ruin the future. You are allowed to enhance the present, but not at the expense of ruining the future. Okay, so we have this balance. All right, we're talking a few different kinds of balance. One balance is what we want versus what we need. Another balance is what we need versus what the world, the environment, other creatures need. And the last one here also is the balance between what the future demands, let's say, versus what the present demands versus what the future requires. Okay. Let's take a quick pause. Now we're going to get a little bit more trippy-dippy, but I mean, remember, this is all within the bounds of Halachah. But I really do believe, and I hope it's not a novel point by now, that Halachah is not just about just points of rules. It's not just about laws on the book. It's really about trying to craft a wise and holistic way of living life. Not just as a sense of like, isn't that nice? It is obligatory, but it is also telling us and teaching us something about what it means to live in the world. So just any quick thoughts, or not so quick thoughts? Any reflections? All right, and not just because I'm recording, but because there was a special request. I'm trying to take care not to slurp my tea anymore. Okay, so here's a very famous line. Ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh. And Ibn Ezra, in his famous way, as we're going to see, is like, wait a second, what is this word? This is very strange. The pasuk is like worded weirdly. But we're going to look at a bunch of different ways of understanding this clause. It says, is the tree of a field human? So Rashi says, the word ki, right, ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh, functions in the sense of maybe, right, perhaps. Maybe a tree of the field is human, or should be considered like a human, i.e., like one of the people that you're fighting against, and should be included in the proscription of the town before you. In other words, when you're waging war on a city, maybe the tree is one of the things that you're attacking. This is what we call a havamina, and should suffer with hunger and thirst, just like the human inhabitants of the city. So what's the havamina that Rashi's saying? Ki means asking a question. And what's the question it's asking? Is the tree included with what?
Humans.
Yeah, which humans?
Oh, like your enemies.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Is the tree your enemy? And the answer is, I mean, it doesn't say it explicitly. It's rhetorical. The answer is no, right? And he says, why would you destroy it? What? Right? So Rashi is like objecting to this principle. But again, he is acknowledging, again, the potential of barbarism, which the Torah is resisting. There is the potential of waging total war. To what it means to wage war against the city means that the tree counts. You can kill the tree. Kill the tree to kill the city. And the answer is no. The tree is not like a human being. It does not have right. It can't sue you at the International Criminal Court. The tree cannot defend itself. Thus, you cannot attack it. You may not destroy it.
Not to go off on too far a tangent, but where do children or babies fall in that same sort of philosophy?
It
It's
is
not
rare
philosophy.
in which you would kill a baby.
Okay, so it's the same thing. It's defenseless, a defenseless child. You wouldn't
Yeah,
hurt
there's, I put it this way, it's exceptional when God says, you have to consign the whole city to, like, Irani Dachad, right? Like, the whole city is idolatrous and nothing can remain. Or, like, the Amalek, right? That was King Saul's mistake, is that he let the women and children survive. But, I mean, those things are awful to think about. But on the other hand, it also says that the norm, right? Those are the exceptions that prove the rule. The rule is you don't kill women and children, right? The rule is you don't kill the non-combatants. Okay. I mean, I think, again, like, Torah is not fooling us. War is hell, right? And that's why war and death will be abolished and swallowed up when the Mashiach comes, right? Like, this is what it means to live in Gullus. This is what it means to live in the thick of the real world. But again, living in a non-ideal circumstance does not give you license to be wicked, does not give you license to forget what it means to be a human being. Okay, so we have the Sefer Chinuch, which is a wonderful medieval work. It is it's a book of the mitzvot that goes according to the parsha. So every parsha, it talks about the mitzvot that are relevant to that parsha. It is anonymous. It's ascribed to the Ra'ah, but Rabbi Aaron Halevi, but we don't know who really wrote it. But he has a point here in his analysis of Shoftim, of this mitzvah of Bal Tashchit. He says, not to destroy fruit trees. He says, we are prevented from cutting down such trees when besieging a city in order to distress the city's population and grieve their hearts. Now, the in order means, like, that's what would happen if you cut down the tree. So what is he's saying that, again, I think this is an enhancement of Rashi's point. When you are waging war against a city, you are not allowed to reduce the tree to merely a thing. And or an instrument. An instrument to what? An instrument to suffering, to cause suffering. You're not allowed to transform the tree in your eyes and reduce it to just be a way to hurt other people. It has its own way. It does have its own inherent rights. You're not allowed to reduce it just to be a weapon. Now, you are literally allowed to cut down a specific kind of tree in a specific circumstance to literally turn it into a weapon. But what you're not allowed to do, in a sense, is turn the tree as tree into a weapon. You cannot deprive them of what the tree offers. It says two things. One is the tree has its own rights to survive, the fruit tree does. And the second one is that the human being has a right to the food that it produces. And you're not allowed to intervene and interrupt that symbiotic relationship. You cannot. The Sefer Chinuch is getting at the intentionality behind what it means to intervene in this kind of way. You're not allowed to reduce the tree into an instrument of pain. It has a buffer against how you want to corrupt it. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. Rashi and Sefer Chinuch are saying, is the tree like a human? And the answer is no. But it's asking the question. Ibn Ezra and Ramban, as we're about to see, instead of asking, is the tree like a human, turn it into a statement. The human, for the human, ki can also mean because, or behold, for the human is like a tree. So is the tree like a human is one way of putting it. And Ibn Ezra is about to say, the human is like a tree. What's he mean by that? He says, what reason would the Torah have to say that one may not cut down a fruit-bearing tree, since it cannot flee from you? Right? He says, basically he's saying, he doesn't know Rashi. He's saying, he doesn't know Rashi. But he's basically saying, that's a dumb question. Obviously trees aren't human beings. They can't walk. So obviously that's not what it's saying. What is it really saying? I love that. It's so, shady. And he says, to my mind, there's no reason for all of this, saying ki is a question. But rather, this is the meaning. He says, from it you may eat, and you may not cut it down, for the human being is a tree in the field. You can't cut it down because a human being is the tree. What does that mean? That's weird. Weren't you just saying that the tree is not like a human being? He says it means that human life is the tree. It's sustained by the tree in the field. He has a similar pasuk he's about to bring in. It's the case of a boss and their employee. No, sorry, it's a case, not boss and employee. It's a case of somebody who you owe a debt to, right? You have you're a Bal Chov. Someone has an IOU against you. And they're allowed to take something as a collateral, right? I don't know if you've ever been in Hawk or something like that, right? But someone that you owe a debt to is allowed to own something of yours to make sure that you give it back. Let's say you borrow somebody's, I don't know, lawnmower or whatever, and you say, I'm going to bring it back, but until I bring it back, to let you know, so that you have something of mine, here is my, I don't know, what would you give as a collateral for a lawnmower? Here's my Milchig Instant Pot. All right, and then the person's like, great, I have your Milchig Instant Pot. But what you're not allowed to take is, let's say I need your lawnmower, and I am and I make bone broth. I make soup for a living. Okay? Then you're not allowed to take my Instant Pot because I need that Instant Pot to make the soup. All right, let's bring it back to trees, right? I'm not allowed to cut down the fruit tree because I need the tree to live. Right? So when it says ki nefesh hu, it means it is the source of your life. It is what your life relies on. Ki chaye nefesh hu chovel, because you would be then collateralizing, like taking ransom, what someone needs to live. That's what chovel means, to take ransom, to keep something captive, but chovel can also mean to damage. I mean, in this case, it means to take ransom, but it also means to, I think in the case of the tree, it means to damage. You are essentially damaging, right, what human life relies on, which is a symbiotic relationship with trees. Right? They are the engine that produce what you need to live. All right, we got a comment in the chat. Yes, okay. I mean, we're not getting. This is not the Kabbalah class. This is the Halachah class. You want to talk about communicating tree? Actually, it is true. Trees, there's a lot of really cool new information about the way that trees do communicate with each other. They make room for each other to make sure that every tree in the grove has enough light and has enough shade. That there's might be communication networks via the roots and stuff like that. Some really cool stuff. Also, mushrooms. Mushrooms all talk to each other. Really cool biological stuff out there. Great writing about that in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. So this is, I mean, it's real science. It's not just hippy-dippy nonsense. But back to the laws. So you're not allowed to kill the tree because a human is a tree. There is a deep symbiosis. To kill the tree is to kill human beings, and in a way, vice versa. Okay, we get how Ibn Ezra found that because it says, Ki Adam Eitz HaSadeh, the essence of human life is in trees. Okay, so here I want to bring our attention to context again. So the pasuk in highlighting Ki Adam Eitz HaSadeh, whether it's Rashi saying it's protecting the inherent right of the tree that can't defend itself, or it's Ibn Ezra saying it is recognizing the essential place trees have within the ecological system, and specifically to sustain human life. It recognizes that to destroy a fruit-bearing tree is not just to hurt a thing. It's not just to cut down a said tree. It is also to inflict damage and pain, like what Sefer Chinuch was saying, on those around it, on human beings around it, on the environment, on the biome, etc. It reverberates into the future and into the surrounding context. So I want us to think then about interconnectivity, because I don't think this is something I'm just imposing in my reading on the text. I think this is implicit within the function of the verse and of this halakha of Bal Tashchit. So Nachmanides, who is a 13th century Spanish mystic, Torah commentator, and legalist, agrees with Ibn Ezra. He loves Ibn Ezra's reading. He says Rabbi Avraham, he means Avraham ibn Ezra. He agrees with it. He agrees that the tree is the essence of the human life. But, and here I didn't want to go into the whole Gemara, but he cites the main Talmudic discussion, which is found in Bava Kama, page 91, folio 91, in which it, like we implied earlier, it's not just about a specific circumstance of war, but rather this is governing what resource expenditure looks like in the way that you navigate your needs in the natural world. And the Talmud does end up creating all these different exceptions of ways in which you are allowed to intervene. You are allowed to cut down, let's say, a non-fruit-bearing tree even when you don't need it to make a weapon, or you are allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree in specific circumstances. So, and again, the ideal of, like leave no trace hits the real of needing to intervene in the world. So he says, yes, I love what Ibn Ezra said, but according to the rabbis in the Talmud, it says one is allowed to cut down a food-yielding tree to build a siege work, but the Torah specifying only trees that do not yield food is to prioritize. So the Gemara says, in a specific circumstance, even a fruit-bearing tree you're allowed to cut down to make a weapon, to make a siege work, right, to wage war against the city. But he's saying it's to prioritize. So when it says only trees that do not yield food, means that a barren tree should be cut down prior to a fruitful tree. So what's the circumstance now he's saying that the rabbis say you are allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree, i.e. again, to make a robust intervention into the natural world? If what's the case? So it's not saying you can never do it, but rather, when can you?
If there's no other trees around and
Good.
you need that tree for weaponry.
Exactly. That's exactly right. There are no more Atzei Srach around, no more non-fruity trees around. And only in, again, the specific emergent case of needing it to... so that is specifically now in the case of war. So you couldn't say that then necessarily about non-war cases, but he keeps on going. And so to them, if the meaning of the Parsha, right, of this little topic, is that the Torah cautions do not destroy its trees wantonly, meaning not for the strict need of the siege, which is the common tactic for armies. Okay, so on one hand, he just gave some latitude in terms of what is allowed, right? You are allowed in this specific circumstance to cut down a fruit tree, but now he's kind of circling around it again. And he's saying the common tactic in war waging is to be wantonly destructive, is to wage total war. The reason being that soldiers will raze a city and its surrounding territory, potentially to seize it, as it was said, fell every good tree and stop up every well of water in 2 Kings. Now that is, when you get into the book of 2 Kings, there are very few good kings left. So when Ramban is citing that pasuk, right, this is after David, after Solomon, right, after the split of the nations, after the north has descended into idolatry and wickedness, after the south has had its own share of not so great kings, right? So when it's saying it's an example from the Torah, right, of waging total war, not cut down every tree, stop up all the irrigation. Ramban says, no, that's not precedent. You may not act like that so destructively, he says. For you must trust in God to deliver it to your hand. Now, I find that very interesting. In a way, what he's saying is to wage total war. And you're using the context of war, even though that is the literal context from the pasuk, I think it's also really quite, in telling of a context for what we're talking about in general. You are not allowed to wage war on the environment. Or rather, if you imagine a coming time in which access to natural resources is more challenging, right? Like some people are predicting vis-a-vis climate change. Most people. The Torah is saying there are things, though, that you're not allowed to devolve into total war. You're not allowed to devolve into barbarism. Our lives might become much more like war. There's a lot that's written in political science now about, the increase of refugees because of climate-related change, right? And there are going to be more and more displaced people as more and more places on Earth, chas v'shalom, but become less welcome to habitation. What happens when more and more people from more and more parts of the world, which a certain American governing leader called a very rude way, called in a very rude way, right, are knocking at the gates of your town, are knocking at the gates of your nation? What are you going to do? We might well think of ourselves as being in a much more martial context, even when we're not technically waging war. And Ramban is saying, even in the case of a siege mentality, the Torah is not letting us devolve, not letting us reduce total war as totalizing. It's totalitarianism. Total war says the human being can do whatever it wants. It can wreck and destroy and wreak havoc. And Ramban is re-enchanting our perspective with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, with God, with faith, to say, you are not allowed to take complete control of the circumstance and just raise it to its studs. Rather, you must trust in God. Now, he says to deliver it to your hand, because he's saying, God will help you win this war. But he's saying there's certain things you're allowed to do and certain things you're not allowed to do. You have to be faithful. God is fighting the war with you. The way God isn't fighting the war with you is if you're doing things God wouldn't want you to do. Quite ironic that, because people are like, oh, it's a holy war. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to do terrible things because God lets me. Ramban's saying no. Actually, for you to really believe in God and be in this non-ideal circumstance, war, it means that your hand is stayed. For the human being is a tree in the field, as you will eat from it and be sustained. Fleeing to the city from you, like the tree would, in refuge, that is, you will also be sustained by it after the city is conquered, exactly as Susie intuited. What does that mean? It means there is a day after tomorrow. It recognizes the interconnectedness of all things, of human beings and the environment, of you and your neighbor, even your enemy. To total war, right, to reduce yourself and the world to total war means that you have now created a world less habitable. Fewer trees that you will be able to eat from. And by you, what we mean is those who live there. So while you are in the siege, you should keep that in mind and do likewise. An incredibly subtle statement, but one that's very bold in its subtlety. While you are in the siege, while you are in siege mentality, while you envision yourself to be on an island, as many certain political theorists are, continually beset by the lapping waves of foreigners, of invading refugees, you may not do so. It resists this kind of, I think, eco-fascist tendency that we're starting to see more and more, that says, human beings that need your help, sorry, bad luck for you, can't help you. We have a right to defend ourselves first. Fortress America. No, Ramban says, in the siege, you still may not think that. You need to remember what it means to have a day after tomorrow, what it means to be committed to the sustainability of the future for everyone who lives here now and for those in the next day as well. It's what it is the reduction of the possibility of being in the most besieged mindset, right? Oh God, I'm in the middle of a siege. If even in a siege everything is not allowed, that's Ramban's insistence. Not everything is allowed. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was the founder of Neo-Orthodoxy, now we call it Modern Orthodoxy, in 19th century Germany. And, actually, I haven't been introduced to his work so much until recently, but a real champion of a kind of Torahitic humanism that I find immensely powerful and really compelling. And I think a lot of people, in a way, reduce it to poetry because it is poetic. But I think the reason I included him in this class on the law is that this is not speaking merely aspirationally. We'll get to aspiration down there. That's what's called midat chasidut. But right now we're talking about what's obligatory, what's required of us. Lo tashchit is a mitzvah. And we're trying to figure out what that mitzvah means. It has so far meant that in, the strict reading of it is that in the specific case of war, you're allowed to intervene in certain ways and not intervene in other ways when it comes to trees which bear fruit. Fine. But it becomes, as we're about to see soon, the paradigm for what it means for how do you negotiate your needs within the needs of the natural world. How are you allowed to intervene, and how are you kept from intervening too much? Questions of conservation, questions of sustainability. So he says, do not cut down the trees surrounding the city for the purpose of destroying them. That's what lo tashchit means, Bal Tashchit. You're not allowed to destroy. That's literally what it means, that you're not allowed to destroy. So, if you cut down the tree because you want to destroy it, that is what's not allowed. Or better, do not destroy them just to cut them down, such that the whole purpose of your action is the swing of the axe, right? Which is a phrase from the pasuk, destructively. You are permitted to eat of them. And more than that, you are obligated to eat to keep them alive. Now that's remember to what we were saying before, different kinds of mitzvah. He's saying that there is a positive mitzvah here. The positive mitzvah is that actually, unless you have the specific context in which you need to cut down a certain kind of tree, you actually have the obligation to keep them alive. You are obligated in their maintenance and sustenance. It is a positive mitzvah not to destroy. In other words, you are positively commanded to keep destruction from happening. And to think about, I think, what that entails is really, how is that pieced out? That's why he's saying maybe he's taken more poetically, but he's saying the mitzvah of Bal Tashchit is that it's not just don't destroy things, it's also keep things from withering away, keep things alive, keep things sustained. And do not cut it down is the negative commandment. So if you violate it, you're actually violating two commandments, he's saying, a positive and a negative. You're violating the commandment of do not destroy, i.e. that you're not allowed just to wantonly wreak your way through creation. He's also saying you're also violating the positive commandment of what it means to, kind of what we were talking about last week, of what it means to be responsible for the sustenance and the sustainability of creation. Okay. So here we have the Rambam kind of bringing his very systematic perspective. So when we say Bal Tashchit, let's be, we're not generally in a siege. So what does it mean for, how, let's say you're doing renovations on your backyard or something, how am I allowed to, landscape? So he says, one may not cut down food-yielding trees around a city during a siege. Siege, come on! As it was said, do not destroy its trees. Okay, we get that. Everyone understands that. Anyone who does destroy trees during siege will receive lashes. Now, that's a really, you get whipped. Now, the point of that is to say it is a lav. It is a negative commandment. If you violate a negative commandment, that's the kind of the way you are punished. Now, again, bracketing the kind of like corporeal punishment, which isn't so popular anymore. What it means, though, is that how are you not being punished? It's actually a really important point. How are you not being punished? Imagine different ways people are punished, right? Just kind of name them, list them off. How are people punished? Sent to their room without dessert. Okay, but like in the adult world, sent to jail, right? That's one, right? Sent to jail. Okay, how else are you punished?
Fined.
Fined.
Yeah, pay money.
Good. And are you fined here?
No.
No, you're also not murdered, right? So a tree is not a human being. If you cut down a tree, you're not murdered. You're not executed. Okay, fine. But it's basically the next level under that. It is a criminal offense. It is a criminal offense to do this. Now, isn't that's, I think, the kind of, it's severe, right? And not just in a siege. Okay, fine. Now we're finally moving out of the siege. But any context or situation that anyone who cuts down a food-yielding tree wantonly is violating the rule, right? When I say receives lashes, it means you violated the rule. The tree may be cut down if it is, but where are the circumstances? What are the exceptions here? So you're not allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree for no reason. It seems to, right, but that implies then that if there are reasons to do it, like justificatory reasons, if you can justify doing it, then you can do it. Okay, so what are the exceptions? The exceptions are this. You're allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree if it is damaging other trees, or because it's damaging other fields, or if its lumber is worth more, parenthetically, than its fruit. The Torah only forbade wanton destruction. Okay, so just in your words, when are you allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree according to the Rambam?
When the value of its lumber would be more than its fruit, or if it's causing damage to other trees.
Good. Okay, so in a way, so let's do the latter point first. If the tree has become a combatant, then you can kill it. Does that make sense? If the tree is in a way deviating from what it means to live within the system, because it is parasitic, right? It is maybe there's, Mom, not to make you sad, but growing up, we had this huge, gorgeous maple tree in front of the house. And I came home to visit, and it was gone. And the reason was because the city commanded it to be cut down because it was tested, and there was a certain kind, was it mold or something like that? I don't know. There was something sad. There was something wrong, so it had to be cut down because it was a danger to the other trees. This tree that grew up on had like these beautiful big trees up, and now there's like kind of little saplings there. But hopefully, again, in the next few decades, they'll be back. So we have to make sure that there are next few decades, so we not commit to. So point is, if once the tree becomes a combatant, then you are allowed to defend yourself against it, right? Then you are allowed to remove it from the system. That makes sense, right? It's not, life is a conditional right you have. You're not allowed to just like go around wantonly hurting people and saying, well, I'm alive, right? The tree is functioning. It is in a way an agent in the system, and once it becomes an aberrant agent, then it needs to be dealt with. Okay, good. Now we have a little bit more. That's like of necessity. I need to cut down the tree, or else all the trees are gone. That makes sense. That's like intuitive. But here's a new one. If the tree's lumber is worth more than its fruit. Now we already saw that implied above when it said when Sforno said if the fruit is minimal and not really worth harvesting anymore, that's the case in which the lumber is worth more. Like, fruit is always going to be worth more. Why? Because it is recurrent. Trees produce fruit every year. That is what's it called? Passive income. I mean, yes, you gotta water it, fertilize it, fine. But the point is that once you have a tree that produces fruit, it's like having a good stock. It keeps on paying off dividends. So the only case in which you are allowed to cut it down is, in a sense, when it's retired, effectively. When the tree is retired. Now, the Taz, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, implies that maybe even in that case you should try to replace it in some way if you're removing it for like less necessary reasons. That's an interesting kind of point you make. Okay, so let's keep on going. It is permitted to cut down a non-fruit-bearing tree even if the tree itself is not needed. Oh, that's interesting. So above it said, if you're in a siege, you are allowed to cut down a non-fruit-bearing tree, but only if you need it for waging war. You need to make a siege work. Now Rambam is saying, you are allowed to cut down a non-fruit-bearing tree. In what context?
any context.
Yeah,
because
basically,
you're not needing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And this, if anything, is like kind of the gesturing towards what ends up becoming, I would call, the corruption of Bal Tashchit. Now, this source sheet is biased, and I want to be very clear about the bias, because I am a polemicist at heart. I am advocating for something. What I am advocating for is the rehabilitation of the desiccated mitzvah of Bal Tashchit. The mitzvah has we'll actually see a text in this regard soon. But the mitzvah is all, as I said before, it's about balance. It's about balance between what the world needs from us and what we need from the world. And one way of reading Bal Tashchit is that it is always allowed to intervene, right, to cut down something, if there is some kind of human benefit from it. That is a perspective I want to qualify. But here we see a gesture towards that point. If the tree has no immediate benefit for human beings, then it can be cut down, right? That's a non-fruit bearing tree. It's not really doing much for us. You can cut it down to, I don't know, whatever, because you want a better view. Who knows? Okay. So I want to look at the Minchas Chinuch, which is a commentary on the Sefer HaChinuch, but here he's actually commenting on the Rambam, and he says, going back to the first point, he says, one receives lashes for cutting down a food-yielding tree, but for destroying other trees, one does not receive lashes. Yet, it still seems that one is violating the Torah prohibition, though you do not receive the lashes since it is not explicit in the text. And this is how Rambam seems to hold. Now that's interesting. So Minchas Chinuch has like a machmir reading of Rambam. He says, you might think that you can just destroy a tree willy-nilly if it is non-fruit bearing, because it says even if it's not needed. But there's a difference between something not being needed and for no reason, right? Remember we said there's a balance between what the world needs and what we need. There's a balance between what we need and what we want. So if you cut down the tree because you want it gone, because there is some kind of tangible improvement, enhancement of your life, fine. You have room to do that. I mean, again, let's keep in mind here. What we're talking about is like what you're allowed to do. If the Torah said you're never allowed to cut down a tree, except because it's got black mold or something, then it would be very hard to live, right? So the law has to make room for what it means to live life, like to own a house, to own property, to, I don't know, let's say you plant a whole bunch of trees, right? Let's say you're a farmer, you plant an orchard of trees, and then a whole bunch of trees just go dead and they're not producing fruit for like 4 years. You know, if you're living in ideal fantasy Torah world, sorry, you planted the tree, what are you going to do? But Torah recognizes you got to live life. You got to cut down trees sometimes. It gets that. But the Minchas Chinuch, I think, is trying to pull a handbrake and say, hold on, just because it's saying that there aren't lashes involved anymore doesn't mean there's still not a principle you're still violating. You're still not allowed to just wantonly just cut swaths of trees down because you want to. There is a strong exception to this. It is never going to be the norm to just cut down the trees. He's saying it's always going to be a justified exception, and that's a very different way to live. You have to always justify it in some way or another. Okay. It's always the exception. It's never the rule, is what the Minchas Chinuch is saying. So the last halacha on this that the Rambam says is, and it's not just trees. Wait, what? It's not just trees. It's really about the natural world writ large. It says it even applies to somebody who destructively breaks vessels, right? Let's say like you take like a cup, you just break it on the ground. Or you rip up clothing, or you tear down a building, or you seal up a spring, or you waste food. All of that violates the commandment, Bal Tashchit. Now that is interesting. Because what does Bal Tashchit mean now? It is no longer just about governing your relationships in war. It is no longer just about governing your relationships to trees. The tree is the paradigm for what? what it means to live sustainably, what it means to not forget things are precious and scarce. Now, nowadays, with fast fashion, H&M, you rip a shirt, you buy a new shirt. We're living in a world in which it is incentivized to get new things, which disincentivizes repairing old things. But this is a very novel idea that is not in any way, shape, or form the way that the world worked until basically a kind of legalized slavery that we just ignore whenever we buy clothes. Right? Why is it the case that the clothes cost more to buy a new shirt? Well, I don't want to know. Right? So the Rambam here is saying to have such a blithe and casual attitude to your property is violating this Torah commandment. He's saying actively to break a vessel or to rip up your clothing or whatever. Right? Think about how powerful a point it is then, when Lo Aleinu Rachmana Litzlan, right, you are mourning the loss of a family member and you tear your shirt. Think about how much more meaningful, nowadays we don't even tear the shirt, right? We tear like a little ribbon thing. But imagine the cathartic power of the one time Torah doesn't just allow you to, but commands you to waste. And the power of that waste is the emotional force of what it means to lose somebody. I think we've really lost, and this is actually my take on Shabbos in a lot of ways. Shabbos should be the only time in which we are being, let's say, luxurious. And we are either lights are on and da-da-da-da-da, right? It's not the most efficient day, Shabbos. But it is the exception because it is the time in which you are allowed to relax and enjoy yourself a little bit, not worry so much. But weekday life, weekday mindset is one of conservation, one of minimizing impact, minimizing footprint. It is a testament to your love of the person that you've lost that you lose. Right? That you lose what you loved. This shirt. This thing that's precious to you. Once the things that we own are no longer precious, then yeah, you might as well just rip a ribbon. Right? It's the cathartic power of what it means that expresses and captures what it means, the enormity of your love and the loss that you have. That's reflected then now in the loss that you then kind of safely inflict on yourself again. Chas v'shalom, you should never inflict harm on yourself. It's against the Torah. It's evidence of something very sad, and I hope that everyone finds healing. But you can safely inflict loss, right, by ripping a shirt, destroying a vessel, etc. But that specifically, though, it only works if you live a life that Rambam and Bal Tashchit is telling you that you need to be relating to your things as precious, not just things easily replaceable. The things that we have need to be related to preciously. And I'm saying that the world we live in now is convincing us that's not the case, by incentivizing replacement rather than repair. It's hard to live. The corruption of Bal Tashchit is not our fault. It is reflecting industrialism. It is reflecting an increasingly fungible relationship to our resources and to the things that we own. That exchange is easier and incentivized. To be patriotic is to shop. Consumption is the way to live. Right? It's no wonder Bal Tashchit it has minimal bulwark defense against that. And thus, this class is trying to rehabilitate a notion of it, and it requires a new and I think more expansive way of thinking. So the Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, but he also wrote a very important commentary on the Mishnah Torah called Kesef Mishnah, says, and he's going to expand on this. I can't leave theology entirely behind. He says, this is like it says in Shabbat 105b, which is not at all about, right, Bal Tashchit literally, but is saying, he's quoting, Rav Yosef is quoting Rebbe, who said, that's below. I think it is still, I'm sorry, I forgot who said this. It says, one who tears your garments in anger, or breaks vessels in anger, or scatters money in anger, should be considered an idol worshiper in your eyes. as that is the craft of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Today, the evil inclination, tells you to do this. Tomorrow, it tells you to do that. Until eventually, when you can no longer control yourself, it tells you to go worship idols, and you do it. Okay, so what's the idolatry that the Breita is referring to here?
Wanton destruction. Just destroying anything for the sake of destroying, or in anger.
You're being a good materialist anthropologist in the sense that, yes, that is the practice of idolatry. But if we think of it as an ideal system, right? What's this idolatry? In other words, who's this alien? Who are you worshiping when you do it? I mean, just look at the text and do it, and let the gears in your brain tinker around.
Consumerism, or is that more modern?
Well, there's no buying happening here.
Okay, yeah.
But I'll bring us back there. But
I mean, waste, but yeah.
Again, that's the practice. The practice is waste. True. The practice is needless destruction. But who are you worshiping when you do that? Whom are you worshiping?
Actually, yourself. You're forgetting that it comes from Hashem, and you're saying, it's mine, it doesn't matter, I can destroy it.
So that is precisely the reading of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in his book Chorev, which is like his. It's a huge book that's about, that's like a way to understand his book of 19 letters. But it's really, again, like I really like on a big deep dive in Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. But it is like a massive encyclopedic compendium of what Torah means vis-a-vis human life. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch coined the phrase Torah im derech eretz, right? Torah with living in the world. Torah with what it means to be a mensch. And he says, if you regard the things that you have as just things at your disposal, and you forget that all of this was lent to you by God. God lent it to us for wise use only. Never forget that God lent it to us. To destroy things wantonly, it's as if you own it. And Rav Hirsch is saying, you don't own a thing. You are leasing the world. And eventually they're going to come collect. Okay, so one way of putting it is you are displacing the true ownership of God. You are replacing God with yourself. It's so literally, if we just to kind of look at it strictly, it's saying that it leads you to avodah zarah because what are you divinizing in a way? Your desires. You are letting your desires drive the car. I want to, or my passion takes me over, and I believe in that moment that I have the right to misappropriate and misuse what I've been blessed with. And Rav Hirsch, I think, thinking of this Gemara, is saying, no, you can't, you shan't. You need to be a mensch. You need to be a member of the human community. You need to be a member of the creation community, the creature community. It says there's no one nearer to idolatry than one who can disregard the fact that all things are the creatures and property of God. That's idolatry, he says. Idolatry is misappropriation. You think it's yours. It's not. Now we've moved away from just the nuts and bolts of the Halachah. But, that is the commentary that Yosef Karo, the Mechaber, is bringing to this point. It's not just trees. It's really about your disposition towards the world. It's becoming fuzzy because now what we have is a little bit less of clear, bright line guidance. It says that you're not allowed to just destroy your property wantonly anymore. Okay. But I want to bring back this question about need. So the Noda Yehuda, who is Eliezer Landau, 17th late 17th, or no, 18th century Prague-based rabbi, very important halachic writer. He kind of typifies what becomes the kind of consensus around Bal Tashchit. He says, all that the rabbis instituted was modeled after the Torah principle not to destroy that from which a human being can benefit. That's the rule. If you can benefit from its destruction, then you can destroy it. It becomes, in a way, a license to destroy. He says you are allowed to destroy if you benefit from it, he says. I.e., not to destroy or waste the potential benefit. It is I love all Torah. I love all of our sages. This is a very crass reading of this, because what's being destroyed, he says? Profit. That's what's being destroyed when you cut down the tree. It's potential dividends. It is not the way I would read the pasuk, but fine, okay. He says, is it possible that Bal Tashchit applies even to something ownerless? No, of course not. Right? So, okay, you're walking around in like a forest or something, right? And like nobody owns the forest, and you happen upon, I don't know, something. Yeah, you can do whatever you want. No one's gonna stop you. It's a victimless crime, he says. No one's hurting because of it. Because something that will cost a person nothing is not included in the prohibition of Bal Tashchit. So what Bal Tashchit becomes, in a way, is property rights in this vision. Right? Because the protected elements of it are limiting what you can do with property. It's not saying what you're allowed to do with the things that you own, but rather it's saying when you own something, here are the conditions of use, of what it means to own and use something. But if something is not owned by anybody, then you don't have to worry about potential harm that's inflicted by destroying it, because what are we trying to protect? The needless destruction of profit. Now, I mean, to be fair to the reading, it is still sustainably oriented in the sense that the things that exist, the things that we have stewardship over, the things that we govern, that's in our care, needs to be protected for what they provide, thinking of the future, right? You're not allowed just to say, well, I own it and no one can stop me. No, you can't cut down a fruit-bearing tree or something like that because you want to. You need to remember that it is part of what it means, what your children need to. Right? It's part of what the world needs. So when it says what you're destroying is potential benefit, I mean, like, let's not just completely say that's like dismiss that. It's an important point. Not to forget that you are, to act destructively is to forget that there is a moment after right now. That there's a moment after the present. That there is a future. You need to remember that things have potential futures, and those things, and that future needs to be protected. And that conditions your present. Right? That limits what you can do in the present. But he says, if there's no immediate loss to people, if there's no direct loss, rather, then you're allowed. Okay, so that is what I would say becomes like the trajectory of a very property-oriented version of Bal Tashchit. But again, this class is trying to, I think, rehabilitate a more robust reading of Bal Tashchit. So, let's look at another Gemara. Rav Yosef cites Rebbe. This is the Rav Yosef say Rebbe. He says, a person may not spill out the water from their well when others need it. Now, it is actually like an adage that's being cited about specifically a minute case of marriage law. But the kind of idiom that he quotes is a person cannot basically ruin your water system just because. Why? Why? Now, it's resisting, I think, something in the Noda B'Yehuda. Because whose needs are being taken into consideration? Is it just the property owner?
Everybody. Good.
The things that you own aren't just about what benefits you get from them as the owner, but rather this thing exists within a system of need, within an interconnected system. Okay? Thus, even if you don't need it anymore, that doesn't just give you license to blithely wreck it. You need to take in consideration the environment, the needs of those around you. Environmental needs, right? Things like that. Rashi says that a person cannot spill out the water from the well, even if you don't need it, because other people need it, right? That's the point, that other people's needs are included in this. Afal pi she'ein sarich, right? Afal pi she'ein sarich. He says, even though you don't need it anymore, other people do. That's the insistence. The Meiri, which is another Spanish medieval commentator, but whose commentary was only found actually in the modern period, beautifully written in gorgeous Hebrew, he writes, and even if no one objects to it. Now that's especially interesting too. Okay, so above we said, okay, if you own something, then you need to protect your potential benefits. But now it's saying, it's not just your potential benefits you have to protect, but also the needs of others, even if you don't need it anymore. And here comes the Meiri now saying something a little bit stronger. And he says, what? Even if there's no kapeda, even if there's no outrage. In other words, you're not allowed to say, well, you know what? Better to ask forgiveness than ask permission. You can't say that when it comes to something like this. Water is a human right? Everyone needs water. Even if there's not like a conservation board that's going to get in your face and protest this and make sure you don't do it. You're not allowed just to, get rid of it and say, well, you know what? If you needed it, you should have stopped me. Rather, you as the property holder need to anticipate and include the rights and needs of others in what it means for you to act vis-a-vis your own property. So he moves then from the limitation to the principle. He says, anything a person can do to take care not to increase waste and damage to creatures or creation, they must do. So he moves from the negative mitzvah, don't destroy, to the positive mitzvah, going back to Ramban and Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. It's not just don't destroy, it is also make sure, take care not to leave a footprint, not to impact the world wastefully. There's something more than just a limitation on specific cases of landscaping our backyard. Bal Tashchit is talking about what it means to craft a vision of what it means to navigate within the natural world with a mind towards your impact. I recognize it is more of a, a fuzzy penumbra around the law, right? It is not as strictly defined anymore. It gives you plenty of exceptional cases now of if you need this, if you need that, fine. And you know what? It makes sense. But I think what the Meiri is making a point to do is to say, and I think what we saw before as well, is that you cannot forget that those need to remain exceptions. Now, maybe it's a failure of the way that the laws are written in a way by human beings to create new norms out of exceptions. How do we re-exceptionalize what needs to be reconsidered abnormal, what reconsidered marginal, right? How do we renormalize our own minimization of our footprint? I think that's the important halachic question, because halacha is not just about rules in a technical religious sense. A lot of people will be very machmir when it comes to, kashrus, right? Making sure that there's no little bug in your lettuce or whatever. But people are very not machmir about the Meiri's strong principle that he's carving, that Bal Tashchit entails developing a much more attuned consciousness towards your impact. As I said, one may not spill out the waters of the well because others need it. In other words, your needs, your preferences, and others' needs are all in dialogue. And one cannot necessarily trump the others. You can't cut down the fruit tree, maybe, if it is the source of food for other people. If the animals around you need it to eat. If it provides certain nutrients or whatever. And here, what I think is missing is what we end up seeing in this gorgeous teaching from Rav Eliezer Melamed, who is a contemporary Israeli posek, who writes a series of halacha called Penine Halachah, which means pearls of halacha, but also kind of means the interiority of halacha, because he's not just about the rules. He really is writing about halacha is a kind of embodied, what I've called an embodied philosophy. And this part isn't, this is an original translation because this book of his, a lot of his books are translated, but this one has not yet been translated. So I found this when I was doing my research and I was bowled over by it. And I want us to see it as a good example of what this kind of what this kind of rehabilitation of thinking about need looks like. He says, the general prohibition, do not destroy, was intended towards things with human use. But a barren tree, i.e. one that does not bear fruit, was not thought of as being of import, right? This is what we saw. If it's not a fruit-bearing tree, yeah, you can cut it down, even if you don't need it, says Rambam. He says, and thus the principle of do not destroy was not applied to it. And similarly, what we just saw above with the note of Yehuda, if no one owns it, no one's going to stop you, right? It seems like that might even apply to a fruit tree. So he says, Rav Melamed says, in current times, when the population of the earth has skyrocketed, with many dwelling in high-rise buildings, it is absolutely essential to cultivate beautiful gardens. What he means is parks, to benefit from the beauty of nature and its essential benefit for living creatures. Aho! So what's the fruit now? How is he completely reread what a fruit-bearing tree means?
Now
Or a benefit-offering tree. Yeah. Yeah?
It's any tree, any flower, the lawn, everything.
Why?
Because it's a benefit to all of humanity. Because it's something beautiful to look at.
Okay. I mean, but I want us to be like materialist about this. He's saying we think we live in a world of surplus, but we don't. What kind of world of non-surplus, of scarcity do we live in? One in which we have allowed consumerism, industrialism, urbanization detach us and alienate us from nature. So now, our new conditions have re-inculcated actually what it means to need something. What do we need? We need trees. Bichlal! We need trees in general. Every tree is a fruit-bearing tree. Why? Because the fruit is to reconnect us with the created world. And he says, and for this public good, people are willing to invest money. Now, he might mean private parks, in which case you're investing in a membership or something like that. Or maybe he means like a garden in your backyard or like a community garden. Or he means a public park, in which case it is you're paying for a public park. Taxes, right? The point is, if we're going to say that something being of worth is what means it's within the ambit of Bal Tashchit, well, you are spending money every year to maintain non-fruit-bearing trees, which mean we all own the trees. They're a public good. Which then means you're not allowed to just destroy them willy-nilly, because everyone needs them. Therefore, he says, all trees, bushes, and flowers which people regularly cultivate have monetary value. And thus, anyone who destroys them is violating not just a rabbinic, this is a strong point, but a Torah prohibition. That's a very bold thing that he's saying. He's swinging. He is swinging for the fences. And this part really bowled me over. Additionally, he said, even non-fruit-bearing trees have the utility of purifying the atmosphere. Well, what's the fruit borne by trees now? Oxygen. Oxygen is the fruit borne by every single tree that exists. And he's saying, what he's really talking about is strengthening the question of need. Strengthening the question of our emplacement within a system larger than ourselves. We have reduced need to profit, but we forget, actually, how the economy works. The economy is not just about property holders profiting off of capital. The economy is about is partially about private goods, but it's also about public goods. Public goods like a park, public goods like crown land, right? Public goods like things that we all benefit from, but does not have an immediate, direct formulation. And he's now saying we need to incorporate intangibles, in a sense, right? The non-direct profits, non-immediate profits, but public goods into the way that we consider what it means to be the to'elet that we need to protect, the benefit that we need to protect. It is a creative rereading, but in my opinion, it is not merely poetic. This is a legal point he is making. It is an Isser Torah, he is saying, to be mindless in terms of our impact on the environment. Because as everything is becoming clearer and clearer now, we need it to live. We need it. We need the world. We need trees. We need a healthy, breathable atmosphere. Right? So if we think now of, yes, the Torah is saying only in the case of in which it will not harm us are you allowed then to intervene. He's saying that's right. That is what the Torah is saying. But we need to reconfigure what help and what harm looks like in a world in which we better understand our place within a system larger than ourselves. We need to rethink about the future. Which we go all the way back up to the beginning of this journey, the beginning of the source sheet. I think we saw that already in the original verse, that you're not allowed to destroy a fruit tree because that is punishing the future for the sake of the present. And Rav Melamed is bringing us back to that essential point. We are all mutually, communally, ecologically invested in living embedded within this world. And that requires, per Rabbi Hirsch and per Ramban, not just the negative prohibition to not destroy, and the Miri, the positive commandment to be mindful of and to invest in what it means to protect that which we have. Not just poetry, not just ethics. This is about what we are obligated, responsible to do. Now again, I agree, it is fuzzier again. It is not as reductive in black letter line, but it's not just poetry. There's a gorgeous teaching from the Sefer Chinuch in which he says, okay, we can talk about what the minimal requirements that we have, and then we can also talk about what it really means to live out God's values. I think that's what's missing too, or was gesturing to before about, people are machmir about the lettuce, but they're not machmir about the tree, right? That he's saying there's a way, in a sense, like, what does it mean to be a good Jew? For him, is saying it's like, this is the way of the Hasidim. This is what it means to be a chosid, he says. To be a chosid is to love peace. I wish this is what it meant to be a chosid today. Love peace. Be happy at the good fortune of others. This is what it means to be frum. This is what it means to be frum. And bring them near to the Torah. They will not, frum people, do not destroy even a mustard seed in the world. And they are distressed at every single ruination, every single instance of destruction and spoilage that they see. And if they are able to do any rescuing, or any sustenance work, any conservation, that's the right word for that, conservation, they will save anything they can from destruction with all of their power. What does it mean to devote your capacity towards trying to cultivate and to protect God's world? Again, so we have, I think, the black letter line of Halachah of Bal Tashchit, which is to be a certain basis of conservation. That you're not allowed to just destroy things without a mind towards, and I think let's read robustly, towards the way in which it damages future need. The wider needs of the system in which we live. That is Halachah. And then to be a chassid, what's called midat chasidut, the lifnim mishurat adin, going above and beyond. What it means to really be pious is not just to let the law control you, but then to aspire to, there's a religious environmentalism here. There's a religious sense of what it means to protect God's world. I want to, on one hand, say Halachah has something real to say about the impact that we have in the environment and how it's trying to regulate that. And also to say that there's a principle at stake here, and we've lost it. What it means to reacquaint ourselves and reconnect ourselves with what it means to be a creature within God's creation. That the halacha is not other than that point that we've been talking about. I'll leave with this last point of Rav Melamed, this gorgeous point that's really towards, I think, the end of consciousness. We live faster and quicker and more wastefully every day. Fast fashion, fast food. It's so hard. And again, I don't blame anybody. I never blame a person. The system, the world that we have makes it harder and harder to sit and to think, to see ourselves in connection with the world and others. And I think this is what Rav Melamed is seeing as the handbrake of Bal Tashchit. He says, a person is likened to a tree, as it was said, Ki adam eis hasadeh, the human is a tree in the field. Which, by the way, that pasuk is going to be very important for looking at Tu B'Shvat, which we will next week. He says, not like grasses which grow quickly and in a short time reach their peak. This is a phenomenological reading of a tree. He says, trees grow slowly, and it is only after a while do they reach their maturation and bear fruit. So too with a human being. The process of its development is deliberate and interrelated with other living creatures. Like Shosh said in the chat, trees do communicate. It is only after it reaches its maturity that it can bear fruit. That is, become a partner in the sustaining of the world and its development. Right? A human being is like a tree in that we are deliberate. It takes a while for us to grow. And that duration, that deliberation of what it means to live, that it's slow, it takes time, is an opportunity, and I would say maybe even a command, an obligation for us to pay attention to what it means to develop, to evolve, to recognize that what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a tree? It means to grow. That's what every human and every tree has a right to do, the right to grow. And we need to protect our own right to grow and also defend the rights of others to grow. It is only after it reaches its maturity, after human being reach our maturity, that we can bear our own fruit and become a partner in what it means to be a shotef, a partner, and what it means to be in what it means to sustain the world and its development, in the world's growth. Right? As we grow, the world has a right to grow as well. It says this idealistic tendency is most recognizable in fruit trees, as they are generally less aesthetically pleasing than other trees. But they do not flower for themselves, for their own sake, but rather for the purpose of bearing fruit to sustain human beings and other animals, right? A fruit tree flowers because that's what comes before the fruit. The telos, right, the purpose of the tree is to bear fruit. This is true evolutionarily. It's true in terms of God working through evolution. Trees bear fruit so that things can live. We are in an interconnected, interrelated system. The improved human also must strive to model themselves after a fruit tree, to bestow one's goodness to one's environment and fellow creatures, not to only worry about oneself alone. Bal Tashchit is a moral education through law. It teaches us to conserve ourselves, to conserve the world through restraining ourselves by continually reminding ourselves that we impact others. And the key to, I think, a most matured and full-fledged reading of that principle of be mindful of the way that you can hurt and damage others, and don't do it, is then to also positively recognize the ways that you impact and help others as well. And all of that has to do with what it means to recognize, right, to recognize, but also recognize, to rethink oneself as a member, a sustaining member of something that you are inside of and that you are connected to. What it means to be a creature within God's creation and the responsibilities and blessings that entail, that Bal Tashchit asks us to slow down. It not just asks, it demands that we slow down, that we never forget that we touch others, that we impact others, humans, animals, plants, and matter, and to let that potential impact guide our choices, to remember the wake that we have in the future, the impact that we have in the future, guide us to live wisely in the present. Yash koach. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm so excited to continue this with you further. Please, I hope you're able to join again. Mondays moving forward generally. Next Monday, we'll have a class about the history of and the development of Tu B'Shvat, which is the New Year of the Trees. See how it becomes basically starts as a fiscal holiday, like tax day, and then eventually it turns into becoming a mystical reconnect, a way for us to remember what it is for us to be trees, for us to reconnect with the universe and creation. And then the following week, Sunday evening, we'll take Monday off that week. Sunday evening, we will have our joint Zoom Bishvat Seder with Sharei Shemaim. So I hope you can join for that. We'll have instructions about what fruits and wines that you need, so you can shop ahead of time. And then we'll take a little short break as I start researching Shemitah, and we'll reconvene, and we'll start learning about Shemitah, what it means, and what it can mean for us today. A big ashkoach. Thank you for all of your comments. Thank you for all your thoughts. And thank you for your time. Shkach.